Hook. Image 1. Elias on dock. Serene lake view place immediately after. A quiet corner of nature I could finally call my own. Establishes the peace that is about to be shattered. Setup. Image 2. Certified letter with HOA logo place immediately after. The first sign of the coming storm was a certified letter arriving not about the house, but about the waterline. Visually introduces the antagonist's first move and the official threat. Rising action. Image 3. HOA boat on lake. Carolyn with measuring pole place immediately after. A cheap aluminum boat flying a tiny, official-looking flag, the logo of the Cypress Landing HOA. Shows the direct intrusion and initial escalation. Image 4. Carolyn confronting Elias on dock place immediately after. When they finally docked, without invitation, the confrontation began. Highlights the direct, intense verbal conflict. Image 5. Orange spray paint on rock place immediately after. He'd find cryptic orange spray paint markings on the edges of his property near the lake. Illustrates the petty harassment and property violation. Image 6. Elias researching late at night place immediately after. Elias decided to delve deep into the one thing Carolyn seemed to weaponize. Documentation. Shows his determination and the shift in his strategy. Image 7. Elias behind new security gate. Confronting angry HOA place immediately after. He invested in a massive, ornamental security gate at the entrance to his private drive. Visually represents his stand and the physical barrier. Climax. Image 8. Police cars, fire truck, HOA at Elias's gate place immediately after. He heard not the clank of his gate opening, but the chilling, unmistakable wail of sirens echoing through the quiet woods. Captures the peak of the crisis and Carolyn's shocking overreach. Image 9. Close-up of Elias holding federal documents. Carolyn blurred place immediately after. He simply held up a thick manila folder and addressed the officer, completely bypassing Carolyn and the gaping board members. The visual reveal of his legal weapon and the turning point. Image 10. Carolyn isolated, humiliated at gate place immediately after. Carolyn and the two board members were left alone, standing on the outside of Elias's now legally impenetrable gate. Emphasizes her ultimate defeat and public humiliation. Resolution and impact. Image 11. Elias fishing on tranquil lake. Sign with plaque blurred place immediately after. Life returned to a tranquility Elias had only dreamed of. Shows the restored peace and the long-term positive outcome. Image 12. Close-up of regulated by federal statute plaque place immediately after. The plaque, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, was inscribed with just 4 words, regulated by federal statute. The final, powerful symbolic detail of the story's resolution. The buyer, let's call him Elias, was looking for an escape, a place where the stress of his corporate career could finally dissolve into quiet water and trees. He found it on the far edge of a well-established, though slightly pretentious, community. The property was the last one on a winding gravel lane, a secluded estate that was technically part of the Cypress Landing Homeowners Association, but felt gloriously separate. The crown jewel of the purchase wasn't the rambling, century-old farmhouse. It was the lake. It wasn't a reservoir or a community amenity. It was a sprawling, pristine body of water, perfectly situated and documented as entirely within the estate's boundaries. Elias saw it as his private wilderness, a place for quiet mornings with a fishing rod, not HOA scrutiny. For the first few months, life was exactly as he'd dreamed. The old dock was replaced, the overgrown banks were carefully trimmed, and the property transformed into a retreat that felt a million miles from the pettiness of suburban life. But in any community with rules, power inevitably finds its way to a select few. In Cypress Landing, that power was embodied by Carolyn, the HOA president. She viewed the entire neighborhood not as a collection of private homes, but as an extension of her own meticulously maintained front yard. To her, Elias was an anomaly, a newcomer whose beautiful, secluded property she couldn't properly observe or control. Certified letter with HOA logo. The first sign of the coming storm was a certified letter arriving not about the house, but about the waterline. It was a formal, chillingly bureaucratic demand regarding the acceptable depth of navigable water. a directive Elias initially dismissed as the confused ramblings of an overzealous board. After all, the lake was his. He hadn't touched the water level. Nature had simply brought a beautiful spring rain. The letter, however, made it clear that Carolyn and the HOA were staking a claim, planting a flag in the deepest part of his private, peaceful world, and they were preparing to defend that claim with a terrifying bureaucratic zeal. Elias thought he'd bought a lake. He was about to discover he'd bought a war. The letter about the acceptable depth of navigable water was only the fuse. The first escalation, the true sign that this was going to be a battle, came a week later in the form of an unwelcome visitor. Elias was enjoying a quiet Saturday on his new dock, the sun just warming the mist off the water, when a small, unfamiliar motorboat appeared. It wasn't a recreational craft. The boat contained not one, but two members of the board, led by Carolyn. They weren't there to wave hello. They were there with a clipboard and a measuring pole. Elias watched in disbelief as they motored across the private, secluded waters he'd just purchased, dipping their pole into various spots and scribbling notes. Carolyn confronting Elias on dock. When they finally docked, without invitation, the confrontation began. Carolyn, her posture rigid, informed Elias that the HOA's decades-old covenants stipulated that the community had an interest in the aesthetic and environmental integrity of all waterways bordering their property, regardless of private ownership. She claimed that the recent spring rains had caused the lake's water level to rise 6 inches above a historical average, potentially damaging the community's downstream drainage system and, more importantly to her, making the lake look untidy. Elias pointed out, patiently, that the lake was not only entirely within his deeded property lines, but it was also a natural, spring-fed body of water and he had no control over the weather. Carolyn was unmoved. She presented him with a formal notice of violation for unauthorized modification of a water feature, complete with an immediate fine of $500. This was the first taste of the absurdity. The dispute wasn't about a garish paint color or an unkempt lawn. It was about the rain. The harassment swiftly ratcheted up. The initial fine was followed by demands for weekly updates on the lake's depth, accompanied by photographs time-stamped at noon. When Elias ignored the demand, he was issued a $100 per day fine for noncompliance. He hired a local property lawyer, thinking a stern, formal letter would be enough to make the petty board back down. It was not. Carolyn seemed to relish the legal sparring, responding with dense packets of HOA bylaws and obscure regulations, a bureaucratic counterattack that was clearly designed to exhaust and overwhelm him. Elias began to feel like a prisoner on his own land. Image 5, orange spray paint on rock. He'd find cryptic orange spray paint markings on the edges of his property near the lake, clearly placed by the HOA to mark what they considered the legal high water line. A surveillance camera, disguised poorly as a bird feeder, suddenly appeared aimed directly at his lake access point from the neighbor's yard. A neighbor he had never spoken to, now clearly acting under the HOA's direction. The peace he'd paid for was eroding, replaced by constant anxiety and the rage born of relentless, unwarranted intrusion. He had to change his approach. Paying fines was rewarding their bad behavior, and simply fighting the bylaws was a losing battle. The system was designed for the HOA to win. The tension spiked dramatically when Elias decided to make a stand. Image 7, Elias behind new security gate, confronting angry HOA. Tired of the fines and the spying, he invested in a massive ornamental security gate at the entrance to his private drive. A gate that was strictly compliant with HOA aesthetic rules, but was physically substantial. It had a keypad and a loud, definite clank when it locked. The message was clear: stay off my property. Carolyn's reaction was immediate and hysterical. She arrived at the gate the next day, not with a violation notice, but with an angry crowd of 2 other board members and a handful of supportive neighbors, all demanding immediate access for a mandatory environmental inspection. Elias simply stood on his side of the locked gate and calmly refused. He referenced the no trespassing signs he had posted and politely informed them that any further communication should be directed to his attorney. This refusal broke Carolyn's composure. She saw the new gate and his refusal to cooperate not as a defense of private property, but as a personal challenge to her authority. The next certified letter didn't contain a fine. It contained a legal ultimatum: grant access for the inspection within 48 hours, or face an emergency injunction in court, citing public safety hazard and environmental threat. Elias was determined not to yield. He felt the cold fear of the legal system looming, but it was overshadowed by a burning certainty that he was right. He knew that the moment he opened that gate, he would surrender control of his own home forever. But the final, truly shocking escalation, the moment that moved the petty drama into the realm of local legend, happened exactly 48 hours later. As Elias sat in his living room, ready to call his lawyer about the injunction. Image 8: police cars, fire truck, HOA at Elias's gate. He heard not the clank of his gate opening, but the chilling, unmistakable wail of sirens echoing through the quiet woods. Elias researching late at night, Elias decided to delve deep into the one thing Carolyn seemed to weaponize: documentation. He spent weeks poring over his deed, local county records, and historical surveys of the property, searching not for a loophole, but for the fundamental truth of the lake's existence. That research led him to a local land conservancy website, then to dusty archives, and finally to a surprising piece of legislation that was nearly a century old. He discovered that the lake wasn't just a body of water. A small, overlooked tributary fed into it, and that tributary, however minuscule, was listed in several very old, very important documents. The lake and the water flowing through it was not merely a local feature governed by the Cypress Landing HOA. It was, in a technical but legally ironclad sense, connected to a far larger entity. The HOA, having been denied access, and having convinced themselves that Elias was hiding some cataclysmic ecological disaster, had followed through on their most unhinged threat. They had called the emergency services. They had called 911, not just the police, but the fire department, citing a potential hazmat situation involving the water. Elias walked out to his gate to see not only Carolyn and the entire board standing triumphantly on the outside, but 2 squad cars and a large, red fire truck blocking the entrance to his secluded lane. They were there, called by a neighborhood association, over a dispute about the level of water in a private lake. The scene was absurd, terrifying, and the definitive moment the conflict went from petty fines to a full-blown crisis. He knew then that his discovery, the subtle, historic, and powerful legal fact he'd unearthed, had to be unleashed. The time for polite defense was over. It was time for a definitive, stunning, and permanent counterattack. He took a deep breath, looked past the uniformed officers at the smug, expectant face of Carolyn, and made the call that would change everything. The fight over his property was about to become a fight over federal law. The blaring sirens and the flashing red and blue lights painted the scene with an immediate, undeniable intensity. Carolyn, the HOA president, stood at the edge of the locked gate, framed by the chaos she had unleashed. She wore an expression of cold, righteous triumph. She had escalated the fight from paper to panic, forcing an emergency response team, the police and fire department, to descend upon a private property dispute. In her mind, Elias's resistance was now criminal. His defense of his lake was now a public danger. The officer in charge, a clearly exasperated patrolman, approached the gate. He wasn't interested in the nuances of HOA bylaws. He saw an emergency call, a potential hazmat situation, and an obstinate homeowner. He politely, but firmly, asked Elias to open the gate and allow the fire department's crew, clad in heavy gear, to run their initial tests on the suspect water source. Elias, however, was past the point of polite compliance. He knew this was the final, desperate power play. If he opened that gate, he would validate their abuse and surrender his privacy forever. He took a slow breath, absorbing the absurdity of the scene. A fire truck idling over a private lake, all because a neighborhood committee didn't like the water level. The time for his carefully researched legal weapon had arrived. He didn't open the gate. He didn't raise his voice. Image 9, close-up of Elias holding federal documents, Carolyn blurred. He simply held up a thick manila folder and addressed the officer, completely bypassing Carolyn and the gaping board members. He told the officer, in a calm, measured tone, that the situation was not a hazmat emergency, but a civil trespass orchestrated by the local HOA. Then he dropped the bombshell. He presented a series of certified documents, painstakingly researched and legally notarized. He didn't hand the officer a new survey or a property deed. He handed him a copy of the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899, a piece of federal legislation concerning navigable waters. He presented a historical land use map, dating back to the 1930s, that showed the small, overlooked tributary feeding his private lake. And he presented a final, definitive declaration from a specialized environmental attorney. The declaration stated, clearly and unequivocally, that the small stream feeding the lake was deemed a federally protected, navigable waterway. This meant the water, while located entirely on his private land, fell under the jurisdiction of the United States Army Corps of Engineers and was subject to federal regulation, specifically regarding the placement of structures, and, most critically, the unauthorized tampering with water levels. The realization hit Carolyn with physical force. Her smug expression evaporated, replaced by wide, stunned disbelief. She had based her entire legal premise on local covenants and local property law. She had fought tooth and nail to exert community control over the lake, citing regulations about drainage and aesthetics. She had completely failed to look up. Elias's private lake, by virtue of that tiny historic stream, was not just a neighborhood pond. It was, in the eyes of the law, a small, secluded piece of the nation's federal water infrastructure. The legal shockwave was immense. Elias explained to the patrolman that not only did the HOA lack the authority to enforce their water depth rules, but by trying to compel him to modify the natural flow of a federally protected waterway, and by harassing him to gain access, the HOA itself was in violation of federal law. The officer, a man who dealt with noise complaints and speeding tickets, suddenly had a case involving federal statutes dropped into his lap. He immediately stepped away from the gate to consult with his superiors. Carolyn, desperate to salvage her power, began to shout, claiming Elias was making a fool of the police and that his documents were fake. This was the moment of ultimate counter-triumph. Elias produced one last document, a formal cease and desist order. This one wasn't from a local lawyer. It was stamped with the seal of his new counsel, an environmental litigation specialist, and formally cited the federal statute. The order strictly forbade Carolyn, the Cypress Landing HOA, and any of their agents from trespassing, interfering with the natural water flow, or attempting to regulate the lake under any pretense. If they violated the order, they would be subject not to a paltry civil fine, but to the full, overwhelming weight of federal legal consequences, including substantial fines and potential criminal referrals for hindering a federal waterway. The sight of the official seal, the mention of the Army Corps of Engineers, and the sudden, grave silence of the police officer were too much. Carolyn stood frozen, watching her meticulously constructed kingdom of petty rules crumble. She, the great enforcer, had not only been bested by a newcomer, but her act of extreme power, the 911 call, had triggered the very mechanism that now rendered her powerless. The officer returned, his demeanor completely changed. He looked directly at Carolyn, not Elias, and informed her that since the issue involved potential federal jurisdiction and the HOA had no standing to enforce their claims, the emergency response was being terminated. The fire crew was dismissed, the police packed up, and in less than 5 minutes, the sirens faded into the distance. Carolyn isolated, humiliated at gate. Carolyn and the 2 board members were left alone, standing on the outside of Elias's now legally impenetrable gate. They were humiliated, defeated, and trapped by a force far greater than their small-town tyranny. Elias simply locked his gate with a quiet, final clank, looked over his shoulder at the private lake that was now truly and officially his, and walked toward his house. The battle was over. The lake was secured. But the federal water was not done with the Cypress Landing HOA yet. The silence that descended upon Cypress Landing was heavier and more profound than the commotion that preceded it. With the flashing lights gone and the sirens fading to nothingness, all that remained was the figure of Carolyn, the HOA president, standing motionless outside Elias's now impenetrable gate. The humiliation was total, visceral, and witnessed not just by her 2 remaining board members, but by the handful of neighbors who had gathered, drawn by the promise of spectacle. They hadn't witnessed a showdown. They had watched their community's central authority figure suffer a devastating public defeat. A defeat delivered not by an aggressive neighbor, but by an overlooked century-old federal statute. Elias didn't gloat. He had already won the definitive victory. He retreated inside, immediately sending a notarized electronic package to every HOA board member, including the newly appointed cease and desist order and a clear summary of the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899 as it applied to the lake. He concluded his communication with a simple, chillingly effective statement. Any further contact or attempted access regarding the lake must be made through his federal litigation attorney. The fallout within Cypress Landing was swift and explosive. The emergency 911 call, which had wasted the time and resources of 2 local emergency departments, triggered an internal review that rapidly uncovered the HOA's disastrous overreach. The community was suddenly forced to reckon with the staggering fact. Their president, in a fit of bureaucratic pique, had risked local fines and even federal investigation just to police a few inches of water depth. The consequences were layered, beginning with the finances. The first emergency meeting of the HOA board, held without Carolyn, who claimed illness, was chaotic. They were facing not only the legal fees Elias had already incurred, which the board was now compelled to cover, but the immediate threat of litigation from the very state and federal entities whose time they had wasted. The board swiftly voted to suspend all fines levied against Elias and formally apologized in writing for the gross misunderstanding of property jurisdiction. But the apology was only the beginning. The revelation of the federal waterway status rendered their entire chapter on water features and drainage completely moot. Every rule, every regulation, every potential fine they had ever dreamed of applying to the lake and its surrounding area instantly evaporated. The HOA's own governing documents were now found to be in direct, irreconcilable conflict with federal law, making them legally unenforceable, not just for Elias's lake, but for any property bordering or influenced by the stream. The community's attention turned relentlessly on Carolyn. The same people who had followed her lead in enforcing petty aesthetic rules now recognized her as a liability. The board presented her with a choice: resign immediately and accept a finding of gross negligence that would shield the rest of the board from liability, or face a community-wide petition for removal and potential personal legal action to recover the mounting attorney fees. Within 48 hours of the 9/11 incident, Carolyn's reign was over. The great enforcer of Cypress Landing covenants was out, her petty tyranny undone by a century-old piece of legislation she never bothered to read. The symbol of her failure, Elias's private lake, was now a constant, shimmering monument to her downfall. The victory was decisive, but the true magnitude of the twist unfolded in the subsequent months. Because Elias had formally introduced the federal jurisdiction into the dispute, he couldn't simply put the legislation back in the box. The United States Army Corps of Engineers, ACOE, alerted by the legal action, opened an inquiry to confirm the status of the tributary and the lake. The outcome was exactly what Elias's attorney had predicted. A team from the ACOE visited the property, took official measurements, and confirmed that the lake was indeed part of a federally protected system. This didn't just strip the HOA of power. It created a new, unassailable layer of protection for Elias. The ACOE issued formal guidance to Cypress Landing, confirming that the HOA had zero standing to interfere with the water level or flow, and that any request for modification or even inspection would need to go through their federal office first. This was the long-term impact that secured Elias's peace forever. His home and his lake were now untouchable. The HOA couldn't touch his water. They couldn't even regulate the dock he was allowed to build, provided it adhered to ACOE guidelines. The neighborhood association, which prided itself on micromanagement, was forced to accept a permanent, gaping hole in its authority, a legally unassailable private fortress located right in its midst. Elias had not just won his property back. He had legally de-annexed the most important feature of his land from the HOA's control. Every board member, every neighbor, was forced to acknowledge that Elias's lake was not a common feature of Cypress Landing. It was a small but protected piece of American infrastructure. Elias fishing on Tranquil Lake, sign with plaque blurred. Life returned to a tranquility Elias had only dreamed of. The new security gate was never approached again. The bird feeder surveillance camera vanished almost overnight. The old feeling of constant scrutiny and anxiety dissolved, replaced by a quiet vindication. He eventually sold the old, ornate security gate, replacing it with a simple, beautiful custom-designed iron sign at the entrance to his property. It featured his family's name, the address, and a subtle, polished metal plaque underneath. It didn't threaten. It simply stated a fact, a final, bureaucratic punctuation mark on the entire saga. Close-up of regulated by federal statute plaque. The plaque, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, was inscribed with just 4 words, regulated by federal statute. The outcome was a powerful lesson in the nature of rules, power, and the importance of looking beyond the local handbook. Carolyn and the HOA had operated under the delusion that their small world was the only world that mattered, that their petty, self-granted authority was absolute. They discovered that when you escalate a dispute to the point of absurdity, calling 911 over a few inches of rain, you risk inviting in forces that don't care about your bylaws, your aesthetics, or your community spirit. You invite the law of the land, and sometimes that law is 100 years old and entirely on your side. Elias didn't beat the HOA by having the better lawyer. He beat them by finding the bigger jurisdiction. He sits on his dock now, often watching the quiet, protected water. The lake remains his sanctuary, a testament to the idea that freedom sometimes isn't fought for with confrontation, but with quiet, meticulous research. The question remains, how much time and peace are people willing to sacrifice fighting petty tyrants before they realize the ultimate power lies in reading the fine print of history itself? Is your own property truly yours? Or is it just waiting for a panicked phone call to tear your peace apart?